From the deadliest air show in human history to a jet plane that crashed into an ice cream shop, here are 10 horrifying incidents from when air shows went wrong. Number 10. The Sknyliv Air Show disaster. When air shows go wrong, it can be disastrous. There's no better example of just how dangerous an air show can be than the accident at Sknyliv Airfield in Ukraine back in July of 2002. It was truly horrific and widely regarded as the deadliest air show incident in all of human history. A Ukrainian Air Force Su-27 flanker crashed while performing a difficult maneuver at a low altitude. It descended rapidly towards the taxiway, and that was when disaster struck. The left wing of the airplane hit a tree, which caused the plane to go out of control and hit the asphalt, even dragging with it a fence of barbed wire. Even though the two pilots managed to eject to safety, 77 people were killed and 545 people were injured. This was a massive tragedy with an unheard-of loss of life. The barbed wire was dragged over onlookers. Then, the aircraft hit a stationary vehicle and a Tu-75MD transport aircraft before exploding at the same minute it cartwheeled into the crowd of spectators. As you can imagine, it was absolute pandemonium when the explosion occurred. Those directly in the blast died, and others were horribly injured. Apparently, the pilots had been given a faulty map of the airbase, which caused them to misinterpret where the craft was going. It also didn't help that they had allegedly been denied an extra rehearsal flight before the show. Number 9. Screams of terror. In 1972, a disaster of biblical proportions unfolded in Sacramento, resulting in nearly 24 deaths and at least 30 injuries. It all occurred at the end of an air show being held at the executive airport. But the crash didn't happen at the airport. Instead, the pilot attempted to take off on the 3,000-foot F-86 Saberjet aircraft. Instead of taking off and flying away, the aircraft overran the runway and skidded across Freeport Boulevard. The huge aircraft then crashed directly into Farrell's restaurant, a busy ice cream parlor full of unsuspecting customers. There were at least 100 people inside the shop when the airplane literally smashed through the doors. 12 children were killed and 10 adults lost their lives, and 30 others suffered devastating injuries. It was a huge tragedy, but just wait until you hear the next part. In 2020, plans were submitted for a restaurant to be constructed across from the Sacramento Executive Airport. That in itself isn't a bad idea. The problem is that the design included the nose of a Boeing 747 sticking out from the front. Considering that an airplane crashed through an ice cream shop just a few yards away from where the restaurant would be built, it feels like a pretty horrendous idea. And as you can guess, it's not been received very well by the locals. What do you think of air shows? Should they even be legal after all these tragedies? Is the excitement worth the risk? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Then be sure to subscribe to American Eye if you haven't already, so you can get even more intense videos just like this one. Number 8. The Reno Air Races crash. An air show disaster in Reno back in 2011 was caused by a devastating combination of overused aircraft parts and blistering speed. When the seasoned air pilot Jimmy Leeward pushed his modified P-51 Mustang to its limits, cruising at an incredible 445 knots, which was 35 knots faster than Jimmy had ever flown the vehicle before, he ran into a serious problem. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, there were lock nuts on the aerodynamic surface on a part of the tail that hadn't been replaced or maintained in at least 26 years. The worn nuts caused screws to go loose. So when Jimmy sped down the Nevada runway at 445 knots, the loose screws caused dangerous vibrations to occur. The plane then reared up at an impossible 17 Gs, knocking Leeward out cold. No longer in control of the plane, Leeward was helpless as the aircraft rolled, soared towards the ground, then smashed straight into a boxed seating area. It was absolute chaos. According to the report from CNN, Jimmy Leeward was killed instantly. 10 spectators died in the wreckage, and 60 others were injured when a hailstorm of debris came raining down over the stands. The incident was horrifying enough that it nearly put an end to the national championship air races. However, the organizers fought tooth and nail not to be shut down, and the race was held once again the following year. Number 7. The Tenerife airport disaster. This next disaster wasn't at an air show, but it's definitely worth a mention. On March 27, 1977, two 747 passenger jets collided on the runway at the Los Rodeos airport in Spain, now known as the Tenerife North Airport. This was the worst crash to happen at an airport in Spanish history. In fact, it was the deadliest aviation disaster since planes took to the skies. The incident actually took place after a terrorist attack at the Gran Canaria airport, causing a lot of flights to be diverted to the Los Rodeos airport. The airport became congested with way too many airplanes parked on the taxiway, and then a thick screen of fog drifted onto the airfield. Visibility was extremely reduced, with the pilots and the control tower struggling to keep up with what was happening. And then came the collision. KLM Flight 4805 was initiating its takeoff while Pan Am Flight 1736 was still sitting on the runway and about to head onto the taxiway. Basically, one of the airplanes was making a wrong turn while the other was trying to take off. The KLM airliner smashed straight into the Pan Am airliner, and the impact and subsequent fire resulted in everyone on board the KLM flight being killed. In addition, almost everyone who was on board the Pan Am flight also died. There were only 61 survivors from the front section of the airplane. In total, this accident had 583 fatalities, more than any other aviation accident in human history. Number 6. The 1962 Seattle World's Fair accident. The Seattle World Fair used to be a huge deal. It was arguably the most exciting exhibition in the United States back in the 1960s. But on April 21, 1962, the Seattle World's Fair ended in tragedy. For some people, it was a day of excitement, but for one unfortunate family, it was a day the world would never forget, for all the wrong reasons. The fair started, bells went off, balloons were sent into the air, and 10 F-102s flew over the gathering crowds. However, the Rutka family were not in attendance, as they were on vacation in Canada. Their house was sitting empty. What they didn't know was that their trip to Canada saved their lives. One of the Air Force planes that took off above the World's Fair ran into a bit of trouble. It lost control and crashed into the Rutka family's neighborhood, killing 2 of their neighbors and completely destroying their home. The reason for the crash was that the plane's engines apparently flamed out, and the pilot was unable to restart the engine. He was forced to ditch the plane and eject himself to safety, landing near Lake Washington. Unfortunately, there was nothing that could be done about the descending airplane as it smashed directly into the Rutka's home. If they'd been inside, the entire family surely would have died. Lucky for them, they decided to take a family vacation. Number 5. When planes collide. Another horrifying accident at an air show occurred in 1996 in Bartlesville. This accident was not as deadly as some of the other ones throughout aviation history, but it did involve the death of a local news broadcaster. It also involved 2 airplanes that you would never expect to crash into one another. While the pair of biplanes from the early 1900s flew over Frank Phillips Field, they ended up colliding. The pilot of the 1928 KR-31 biplane and the pilot of the Waco biplane, plus both of their passengers, were killed almost instantly when the aircrafts impacted in midair. At the time of the accident, it wasn't clear what caused them to crash. The day had been clear, the weather was sunny, and they were both skilled pilots. The incident happened while one plane made a banking maneuver and the other plane approached from the rear. One plane clipped the other, and both of them ended up turning up for about 300 feet, 90 meters, before spiraling back down to the ground and crashing. One of the planes landed in a grove of trees and burst into flame, while the other smashed into the ground, missing a house by less than 50 yards, 45 meters. Number 4. The crash of the Vulcan bomber. One of the earliest airshow disasters happened in 1958 when a prototype bomber known as the Vulcan decided to make a surprise flyby during an airshow taking place in Nottinghamshire. This proved to be a deadly mistake that would cost many people their lives. Somewhere around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Avro Vulcan VX-770 left the runway. It was the first time this type of vehicle would ever take flight, as it was truly a prototype. The Vulcan took off, it tested its new engines, and the crew of 4 decided it would be a spectacular surprise for those in attendance at the airshow if they made a sneaky appearance. Unfortunately, the starboard wing kinked and then utterly disintegrated, causing the prototype aircraft to plummet towards the Earth. The bomber crashed into the runway controller's caravan and exploded, killing 3 men on the ground and the entire crew of 4. But it could have been worse. According to eyewitness accounts, the wing was coming all the way off, and without skilled intervention, the bomber would have crashed into the crowd of spectators. The pilot fought tooth and nail to keep the airplane straight, causing it to crash into the caravan instead of the stand full of civilians. Instead of just 7 people dying, the number could have been dramatically worse. Number 3. The 1973 Paris Air Show. The 1973 Paris Air Show disaster had a lot to do with politics. During this time, the Soviet Union and the West were competing at everything. One of the biggest competitions going on was to see who could build the very best aircrafts, from supersonic jets to passenger airliners. And so, the Soviets were eager to show off their Tupolev Tu-144 at the 1973 Paris Air Show. Unfortunately, it didn't go as the Russians planned. The aircraft had flown for the very first time the year before, and the Russians were hoping to make a serious impression at the show. And in a way, they did. The initial flight went well, but when the aircraft began to approach for landing, it suddenly arced upwards with all 4 engines at full power. Then it stalled somewhere around 2,000 feet, 600 meters. The aircraft then went into a steep dive, it broke into pieces in midair, most of the plane disintegrated, and it finally crashed. The crash resulted in 15 houses being destroyed and all 6 people on board the Tu-144 being killed, plus 8 casualties on the ground. At least 3 of the dead were children, and at least 6 people received serious injuries because of the devastation. Suffice it to say, the Paris Air Show was a huge disaster for the Russians. Number 2. The Ostend Airport Air Show Massacre. When a light plane crashed 20-odd years ago at the Ostend Airport Air Show, it was a verifiable massacre. The plane was trying to pull out of a nosedive when it accidentally hit the edge of the runway and burst into a massive ball of flame and fire. It happened unfortunately near a first aid post and an area filled with spectators. As you can already guess by the other stories about air show tragedies, it didn't go very well for those involved. The pilot was killed instantly, 9 spectators were caught up in the explosion in the hail of debris, and at least 16 people nearby were injured. Most of the injuries came from serious burns caused by the flaming debris as it rained hellfire on those just looking to enjoy an afternoon of airplanes. Since this horrifying incident, the Austin Air Show has not been held again. Number 1. The Ramstein Air Show. In 1988, the Ramstein Air Show cemented itself as one of the worst disasters in aviation history. While the Italian air squad Frecce Tricolori attempted to complete a complex maneuver known as the Pierced Heart, a completely separate pilot accidentally intersected their course, causing all 5 of the jets to fly straight towards each other while going 370 miles per hour. 3 of the planes collided with each other. The result was a horrendous plane crash. One of the planes went straight down into the runway, a giant fireball of jet fuel straight into a crowd of over 300,000 people. Another plane crashed beside the runway, killing the pilot on impact. And as for the third plane, it crashed into a medical helicopter of all things. Unfortunately for the pilot, he ejected too late and perished on the runway before his parachute was able to be deployed. At the end of this horrific incident, at least 70 people were killed. Not only that, but at least 1,500 were injured. Considering how many fatalities there were and how many lives were ruined that day, the deceased were eventually honored at a memorial just outside of the airbase. Those who were severely mutilated by the falling debris or scorched and burned from the raging fuselage were eventually compensated after many years of legal struggles with the authorities. Have you ever been to an air show? Let me know in the comments about any disasters or close calls you may have seen. Be sure to subscribe, and thanks for watching.